Welcome everyone to this Minerva webinar. With the Australian AGM season just beginning, today we'll be examining the voting results in the ASX 100 from the previous 5 years and placing them within the wider context of corporate culture scandals, environmental concerns, and major regulatory changes, as well as identifying key environmental, social, and governance issues that may inform voting decisions in Australia's 2022 AGM season. And if you want full access to our discussion today, the useful data and analysis provided in today's webinar is all condensed and expanded upon in the downloadable briefing below. If you look at the downloads tab below, you should be able to find that, as well as previous briefings from Minerva, including our briefing for the UK AGM season just passed. So, my name is Alex Whitebrook, ESG Communications Manager at Minerva Analytics, and your host for today. And today I'm joined by our Senior Stewardship Analyst and resident proxy season expert, Thomas Bolger. Hi, Thomas.
Hi, Alex, and thanks for the introduction. So I just want to begin by saying that I'm joining from Melbourne, Australia today, and would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also First Nations people everywhere.
Brilliant. Thanks, Thomas. So let's jump right in and we'll bring the slides up in full for everyone. Australia's AGM season takes place in the last quarter of the year, that's October to December. And as voting gets underway, these are topics that the shareholders and companies should really actively be thinking about that may impact how the AGM season plays out. And that's exactly what we'll be covering today. Executive remuneration, government action on climate change, say on climate votes, ESG resolutions and shareholder proposals, and legislative action on greenwashing. So lots of really interesting topics to cover. So let's begin with executive remuneration, the topic that we can't seem to escape when discussing shareholder voting. What has been happening in executive remuneration in Australia, and is there any difference between how voting takes place in Australia when compared to other markets like the UK and the US?
Well, so Alex, Australia actually has a quite unique remuneration voting system in the market, which is called the two-strike system, which was introduced in 2011. So to get some context of what other markets do in the UK and Europe, there's generally an annual advisory vote on the remuneration report and also a binding vote on the pay policy every 3 years. And in the US, typically there's an annual advisory vote on executive pay, although this could also be every 2 or 3 years, depending on the company. But in Australia, there's an annual advisory vote on the remuneration report, and under the two-strike system, a first strike occurs when a company's remuneration report receives an against vote of 25% or more. And a second strike occurs where a company's next remuneration report also receives an against vote of 25% or more. So in the event of a second strike, the company actually has to put forward a board spill resolution at the AGM, and if this resolution is passed, the company has to hold a spill meeting within 90 days of the AGM, at which all directors who served on the board at the time of the most recent AGM have to stand for re-election other than the managing director. So the idea behind this system is to encourage greater transparency and also engagement between companies and shareholders on remuneration, as it's intended to improve direct accountability when boards are unresponsive to shareholder concerns. But we have seen that shareholders rarely, if ever, vote through the board spill resolution, which could suggest the system may have limited effectiveness, as shareholders do tend to want to avoid destabilising a board over remuneration concerns and therefore tend not to support this vote. It should also be noted that only for and against votes are actually considered when determining whether a strike has occurred, so abstentions here are not included in the calculation. This does raise potential pitfalls of using an abstention when concerns are held with remuneration. But at the same time, we could also view it as companies do wish to avoid a second strike, which could suggest the system is working by actually encouraging companies to make changes when a first strike is received, which also then would mean the board spill resolution isn't passed.
It's really interesting to see how unique Australia's shareholder voting system is, especially when it comes to remuneration. The two-strike system does seem to be working quite effectively in Australia, if it's the case that most companies are trying to avoid that second strike and actually taking action and being open to engagement from shareholders on the issues they raise. But moving on towards voting trends now, what do you predict we'll see in this AGM season? Has there been a similar pattern forming to what we discussed in our UK AGM season review?
So to consider what's going to be happening in this year's AGM season, we can actually look at the past trends on voting on remuneration reports in the ASX 100. So we found that in last year's AGM season, there was a lower number of companies receiving high dissents, that's defined as at least 20% against and abstain votes, being 14 resolutions compared to 16 last year and 15 in 2020. But the big difference is that nearly all of these high dissent resolutions resulted in a remuneration strike. In addition to that, 7 of the remuneration reports were actually voted down by shareholders, a record year for the number of defeats, despite the overall lower number of high dissent resolutions. So these findings actually replicate what we've seen in other markets, and also what we discussed in our recent UK voting review of shareholders picking their battles, which result in a smaller number of high-profile significant dissent levels, but overall low overall dissent levels. So where opposition has been expressed by shareholders, it has often been at a very high level, suggesting a more targeted approach from shareholders in 2021. And this also supports that theory that the strike system is resulting in a response from companies, because when we look at the voting results, the companies that received a strike last year that have held the AGM in the first 6 months of the year, the pre-peak season period, none of them have received a second strike, which indicates that the companies may have responded to shareholder concerns from last year. But we have seen a couple of companies receive a strike already this year, such as Santos and ASX Ltd. At Santos, the concerns were held with a one-off 6 million incentive award granted to the CEO, whilst at ASX, concerns were held with remuneration outcomes for executives in light of performance concerns and the delay in the replacement of its clearinghouse electronic sub-register system. So when we look at the voting results over the past 5 years, what we have tended to see that the most common contributing factors have been ESG failures, one-off special incentive awards, and also misalignment with shareholder and the wider stakeholder experience.
Thanks, Thomas. That's really interesting. In the briefing downloadable in the attachments, we do actually have an included remuneration watch list of the companies that received a remuneration strike in 2021 that shareholders will definitely want to closely examine and see how remuneration committees have responded to previous concerns. Now, moving on to the next topic on this next slide here, let's discuss how ESG is developing in Australia and how companies are responding to key global initiatives.
So what we have seen is that more investment managers in Australia than ever before are engaging companies on matters related to environmental and social issues. So according to the Australasian Responsible Investment Association, Australia's responsible investment market has actually reached a record 1.5 trillion in assets under management, which now represents around 43% of total professionally managed funds. So as part of Minerva's analysis of corporate disclosures of ASX 100 companies, we found that the proportion of companies referencing the UN Social Development Goals and also the TCFD guidelines have been steadily increasing over time, and now a clear majority of companies are referring to both frameworks in its annual reporting.
That is great to see. I don't think I and many other people would expect Australia's responsible investment market to have grown so much. However, at the same time, hasn't there been an increasing focus on greenwashing concerns in Australia? I know that just last year in our Australia ESG update briefing, we noted the rapid increase in climate-related litigation in Australia. It's certainly a hotspot for that kind of activity. As investor demand for availability of sustainability-related financial products increases, the risk of greenwashing has also been increasing, I feel. These kinds of issues cause investors to be misled, and likewise companies face potential reputational and legal risks for misleading statements on their sustainability commitments. Do we expect to see more stringent regulation of sustainability and climate-related claims in Australia?
Yeah, I think that's right, Alex. So in the briefing, we outlined some of the action that regulators have been taking recently. So I'll just give some examples here. So the Australian Securities and Investments Commission has actually recently released guidance for entities offering sustainability-related products on how to avoid making misrepresentations in promotional material, disclosure statements and offerings that could be considered greenwashing. So the guidance does provide clarification on existing disclosure obligations and laws investors should comply with. The Australian Stock Exchange in its corporate plan for 2022 to 26 has stated that it will focus on preventing harms arising from greenwashing and supporting effective climate and sustainability governance disclosure. Then the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission has also highlighted one of its enforcement priorities being manipulative or deceptive environmental and sustainability claims going forward. And finally, the Australian Institute of Company Directors has also published warnings to companies of the legal risks around greenwashing. So we're seeing various different organisations starting to take action in this area. And as you also mentioned, Australia is now the second most active market for climate litigation after the United States. There's just two recent high-profile cases I'll quickly mention here. So in 2021, the federal court actually ruled that the then Environmental Minister, Susan Levy, had a duty to consider the potential harms for young people from climate change when considering fossil fuel projects after an extension of the Northwest New South Wales coal mine operated by Whitehaven was approved. The government actually appealed this ruling, and earlier this year the ruling was overturned. And secondly, the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility is actually currently undertaking legal action against oil and gas giant Santos over its claim that natural gas is clean fuel and that Santos has a credible pathway to net zero. So these statements from regulators and the recent legal cases should be placing companies and investors on notice for the quality of their sustainability claims and their disclosures.
Brilliant. And in the aforementioned ESG update, the analysis did find that there's been concerns over Australia's public policy on climate change. In particular, the inaction and policy uncertainty was acting as a barrier to climate investment opportunities and analysis by organizations like Climate Action Tracker and the Climate Targets Panel, suggesting that Australia was insufficiently aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. With the change in government that we've seen this year following the election, has anything changed on this front?
So Australia is exposed to material, physical and transitional climate risks, which do have a clear financial implication for companies and investors. And as you mentioned, uncertainty around climate policy has been a key concern in the market in recent years. But there does appear to be a shift on climate public policy since the Labour government was elected, and there's two notable developments which have already happened. So on 14th of September 2022, the new government's climate change bill received assent, which actually enshrines an emission reduction target of 43% from 2005 levels by 2030, and also net zero emissions by 2050. So this legislation does provide greater certainty for investors and participants in the energy market, and could provide a more stable policy setting and also signal a new climate-focused policy pathway in Australia. And secondly, in the recent budget announcements, 6.2 million over a 4-year period has been allocated to the Treasury and the Australian Accounting Standards Board to develop and introduce climate reporting standards for large businesses and financial institutions in line with international reporting requirements such as TCFD.
Brilliant. Now, continuing on the theme of climate change, one recent emergent investor initiative is the Say on Climate initiative, which calls for companies to hold a shareholder vote on climate transition action plans. We saw Say on Climate gain quite some support in UK AGMs last year, with a growth in the total number of Say on Climate votes again this year as well. Has the Say on Climate initiative seen the same growth in Australia?
So what we have seen in Australia is that in 2021, several companies made a commitment to holding a Say on Climate vote in 2022, i.e. this year's AGM season. So this peak season will be the first year in which shareholders have climate votes in Australia. So climate transition plans will be an important area of focus for engagement and voting. Analysis by Minerva of global Say on Climate votes has found that no company received shareholder dissent of 20% or more on their climate transition plan vote in 2021. So we found that the voting results do suggest that companies were being rewarded by investors for being first movers on Say on Climate and for their commitment on transparency and engagement. rather than the actual strength of their transition plans. However, dissent on saying climate has actually increased in 2022, suggesting that now that the resolutions are starting to bed in more and good practice and guidelines developed, investors are more willing to hold companies to account for an insufficiently aligned plan. And the early voting results at Australian companies in the pre-peak season months, I do really agree with this view. So on the slide we've highlighted here, in particular Santos and Woodside, who both received very high votes against from shareholders. And already this season, APA Group has also joined these two companies in receiving over 20% dissent. So Australia appears to be somewhat of an outlier when compared to voting results in other markets, because a higher proportion of companies are actually receiving high dissent on, say, on climate votes. But although shareholder dissent tends to be a bit higher in Australia and has been increasing in 2022 globally, no company has actually yet to suffer a defeat on a say in climate votes. And investors do need to be cautious on climate transition plan votes due to the risks of rubber stamping plans that are not aligned with the Paris climate goals.
Now, speaking of shareholder dissent, have climate and ESG issues filtered through to shareholder resolutions themselves in Australia? Are shareholder resolutions a common way of holding directors to account in the Australian market? I remember in our recent webinar on the UK's AGM season, we discussed how shareholder proposals are not that prominent in the market, especially when compared to the US. What's the case here?
So what we've seen in Australia is that the number of shareholder proposals filed in the ASX 100 has been increasing over time. And we've on this slide here, we've got the past 5 years data of the number of shareholder proposals voted on. So 2022 was a record year. The number of proposals filed were 38, and the 2021 season was at a similar level with 37 votes. So in the first 6 months of this year, for pre-peak season period, there's been 10 shareholder proposals voted on. And with obviously the peak season just beginning to happen now, we do expect the total number to reach similar levels to the last 2 years. In regards to, say, the focus of shareholder proposals, ESG issues have dominated shareholder resolutions, and particularly on the number of proposals filed on climate change. But there's also been a number of proposals filed in Australia on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights around engagement and cultural heritage protection in the market, particularly at mining companies.
Yeah, that has been very high profile. It's been very interesting to see such activism from shareholders. It seems that shareholder resolutions are, similarly to the UK, a small but quite significant area for shareholder activism in Australia. But have they seen much success in making change within companies?
When we consider, say, successful shareholder proposals, there's another unique feature of the Australian market here is that management powers in Australia are typically vested exclusively with the directors, and the courts have defined a shareholder resolution as a decision of the company. Therefore, shareholder resolutions are actually binding on the company and are subject to a supermajority requirement of 75% votes in favour. So as a workaround to this, shareholders routinely file resolutions seeking an amendment to the company's constitution in order to introduce the right for shareholders to file an advisory resolution or to express an opinion on a matter which would be then subject to a 50% majority requirement. So the usual approach was taken by shareholders to file this constitution amendment and also advisory resolutions on other matters such as climate change, which are conditional on the constitution amendment proposal being successful. But as the constitution amendment requires a 75% vote in favour, no constitution amendment resolution has actually been successful. And this means that any advisory resolution which is conditional on this resolution cannot pass, no matter what the level of support it receives. So last year, there was actually 5 climate-related resolutions filed by shareholders which received majority support. However, only 2 of them were actually carried. And that's because in the case of Rio Tinto, the board actually recommended shareholders to vote in favour of these 2 proposals. So in response, the shareholder withdrew the constitution amendment request, meaning that these 2 proposals were not actually conditional on that resolution passing. At BHP and South32, The boards also recommended shareholders to vote in favour, but as the proposals were conditional on the Constitution amendments, which was not carried, they were not successful despite receiving over 90% support.
These rules really do make, we've already spoken about how unique Australia's market is when it comes to AGM season, but these rules make Australia very unique in its interactions between shareholders and management. Have these rules impacted the effectiveness of shareholder proposals in Australia? What would have been the general voting trends on shareholder proposals in recent years?
So what we've seen is that voting trends on shareholder proposals in Australia do align with what we've been seeing elsewhere, such as in the US and the UK. So last year, there was a notable increase in the number of votes cast in favour of shareholder proposals, and in particular the increase in support for advisory ESG-related shareholder proposals. So average support on the Constitution Amendment resolutions remains relatively similar, around 5 to 6% votes in favour, but the support for these ESG proposals actually increased from 21.71% on average in 2020 to 35.11% in 2021. That is also impacted by those 5 proposals highlighted in the previous slide. But when we look at the pre-peak season period this year and those 10 resolutions already voted on, whilst the Constitution Amendment proposals have received a similar level of support at 5.6%, the actual level of support on the ESG proposals, all of which have actually been on climate change, has been much lower at 14.39%. So this kind of decline in support on ESG proposals was also seen in the US and the UK this year, and there's various factors which might be contributing to that decline in support. So in 2021, shareholders were successful in a number of proposals, which may have resulted in them being more ambitious this year and more proposals filed on requests, say, for targets and policy, rather than simply asking for greater transparency and reporting on issues. And more sustainability-related proposals have been filed than ever before this year across markets. And connected to this, there's been several institutional investors which have clarified their voting approach on shareholder proposals, and now they'll consider to vote against proposals which they deem to be too directive or seen as micromanaging boards. A third key item is that a number of environmental proposals have actually been withdrawn this year following agreements between boards and shareholders, resulting in these more ambitious proposals left on agendas. And these more ambitious and often first-time proposals do tend to receive lower levels of support until boards and investors become more comfortable with them. And then we do need to recognise that there is a different political and economic environment this year with the war in Ukraine and the crisis in the energy markets, which do appear to be impacting shareholder voting decisions around climate strategy and the need to ensure short-term energy security. So there has been a hesitancy to support these more ambitious climate proposals this year.
Interesting. Well, despite the many detractors from shareholder support of ESG proposals around the world this year, perhaps the new government support for environmental and climate policy in Australia will help counter that and increase the shareholder support for climate-related proposals. I don't know, just throwing ideas out there. I guess we'll see what happens as the season progresses. What are the other key ESG votes that Minerva will be looking out for this season? Just to round us out for this briefing today.
So in the briefing, we highlight a number of, key proposals this year which shareholders will want to be aware of. And in the briefing, which is downloadable in the attachments, we list the companies and the dates of the AGMs where these are happening. So the key votes this year will be the Say on Climate votes, which are the management proposed climate transition plans up for shareholder approval. And then there's also been several shareholder proposals filed, and we've identified these following themes which shareholders are targeting this year. So there's been climate accounting related proposals which have been asking for the inclusion of climate sensitivity analysis in the financial statements. And a proposal filed on this issue at Origin Energy was actually withdrawn after the board agreed to include this information. Another common proposal has been climate capital protection, related proposals which ask for more information on how companies intend to align capital expenditure and operations with net zero. And these have been filed at coal mining companies. There's also at banks been a number of proposals filed on climate financing, i.e. how the company's approach to financing new or expanded fossil fuel projects align with net zero. And we did also see a number of these proposals filed last year as well. And there's also shareholder proposals on climate lobbying, aligning portfolios with net zero, engaging with traditional owners, and also at AGL, there's been 4 shareholder nominated director candidates filed at the AGM. As the shareholder group here are concerned with the AGL's approach to the climate transition and are seeking a board renewal to change the skill sets on the board.
Okay, thanks, Thomas, for being our guide today and taking us through what to expect in the 2022 proxy season in Australia. It is just beginning, but it already seems like it's going to be quite an interesting one. Now, before we wrap up, I must mention that with the growing importance of ESG, Minerva is very well positioned to provide you with all your proxy voting and stewardship needs. We're connected and knowledgeable when it comes to responsible and sustainable investing, being a signatory of the 2020 UK Stewardship Code and a founding member of the industry-leading Net Zero Financial Service Providers Alliance. We've also been widely awarded as leaders in sustainable investment solutions, so contact us via hello@minerva.info if you're interested in hearing more, or you can reach out to me directly at alex.whitebrook@minerva.info. All these contact details are also available in the description below the video. As mentioned, down below you'll also find today's full briefing and slides, and the sign-up link to our next webinar on shareholder proposals around the world. We're also currently working on a briefing on workforce disclosure, so follow our socials or subscribe to our newsletter to hear when those are available. Thank you very much again, Thomas, for joining us today.
Thank you, Alex.